Welcome in, or welcome back to the Veiled Archive. In the history of the hegemony of fear, there is a recurring illusion, the belief that the self is a fortress. For centuries, we have relied on the Gothic tradition to provide us with external monsters: the vampire at the window, the ghost in the attic, the creature in the woods. These are entities that we can, in theory, lock a door against. They represent a threat that is other, a trespasser that must first breach our perimeter to do us harm. But the most terrifying evolution in horror occurs when the door is removed entirely, not by an intruder, but by the very nature of the protagonist's existence. Joelle Felker's Goddess of Ghosts, Shadows, and Secrets represents the definitive modern arrival of invasive empathy. Felker has constructed a reality where the traditional sanctuary of the mind has been structurally abolished. To engage with this work is not to witness a haunting, it is to witness the collapse of the private eye. It is an expansive cerebral siege that asks a singular, devastating question: how do you maintain a soul when you are forced to be the vessel for everyone else's? The work introduces us to a protagonist living a life of careful, reclusive curation. She exists in the quiet corners of a bookstore, surrounded by the occult and the non mainstream, wearing a mask of mundane courage to navigate a world that feels fundamentally abrasive. But the architecture of her life is built upon a terrifying, inherited condition. Her nature is a structural violation of the self. This is what we define as invasive empathy: the inability to interact with the world without being forcibly unmade by the histories of others. Physical proximity becomes a sensory assault, a forced entry into the subconscious sins and sorrows of the stranger. The narrative moves not through simple plot beats, but through the manifestation of a deep seated visceral need. In a moment of crisis, the internal void finally breaches the surface. The protagonist does not just react, she manifests. A darkness she has no control over, composed of vaporous mist and elemental swarms, erupts from within. This transition marks the end of her life as a passive victim of her visions, and her arrival as an active conduit of dread. As the safety of the mask is stripped away, she is forced to confront a world where her identity is merely a component in a much larger ancient architecture. She must begin the brutal process of mythic internalization, learning to harness the shadows not as a gift, but as the only tool capable of surviving a reality where her very existence has been targeted by forces that predated her birth. The distinguishing architecture and the collapse of the perimeter. In the vast landscape of independent horror, works often distinguish themselves through aesthetic intensity or graphic transgression. However, Joelle Felker's Goddess of Ghosts sets itself apart through a far more cerebral achievement: the total demolition of the psychological perimeter, the weaponization of empathy. Most supernatural narratives treat empathy as a moral compass, a tool the protagonist uses to navigate the dark. Felker invertedly structures this. In this work, empathy is not a virtue, it is a vulnerability blueprint. By engineering a protagonist for whom touch is a sensory siege, Felker removes the reader's ability to find comfort in the character's internal monologue. This elevates the work from a mythic fantasy to a study in invasive empathy, setting it apart as a rare exploration of the horror of total transparency, the mythic internalization of systemic dread. What truly separates this work from its contemporaries is its ambition to bridge the gap between ancient tragedy and modern systemic horror. While many indie authors utilize Greek mythology as a decorative skin, Felker utilizes it as a structural engine. She applies the systemic dread typically found in Black Southern Gothic tradition, where the individual is a mere cog in a predatory historical machine, to the divine realm. The protagonist is not just haunted by her lineage, she is systemically drafted into a war she did not initiate. This creates a unique atmosphere where the cosmic indifference of Lovecraft meets the personal malice of a blood vendetta. It is a work that asserts that your history is a ritual and you are merely the fuel. The transformation of the reluctant transgressor. In the traditional horror handoff, the protagonist either survives the monster or becomes one. Felker breaks this binary. She presents a protagonist who is a reluctant transgressor, someone who identifies with the light, but whose survival is predicated on their ability to excel in the dark. This sets the work apart by refusing the sentimentality of a cure. There is no return to the bookstore clerk's innocence. The architecture of the story demands that to save the self, one must embrace the very otherness that was originally the source of the dread. It is an unapologetic endorsement of the dark persona, making it an essential manual for the modern reader navigating a world where staying in the light is no longer an option. Structural intersection of high concept horror. Finally, what sets Goddess of Ghosts apart is its structural alchemy. It is the point on the map where the psychological siege of Stevenson's duality, the predeterminism of an Astor-esque trap, and the sensory transgression of a Barker-esque metamorphosis meet. Felker has built a structural dictionary of fear that honors the unbroken chain while ruthlessly evolving its source. It is not just a book to be read, it is an architecture to be inhabited. To understand the weight of Goddess of Ghosts, Shadows, and Secrets, one must look at the architect behind the veil. Joelle Felker exists at the rare intersection of literary analysis and creative output. In our database, we often see a divide between those who write horror and those who study its bones. Felker is a practitioner of both. Her presence across the digital landscape reveals a creator who has spent years in the archives, obsessively curating the dark persona. She is not merely a storyteller, she is a student of the siege. Her background as a curator of the occult and the non mainstream suggests an intellect that understands the fundamental truth of the hegemony. For a modern, desensitized audience, horror must be more than a jump scare. It must be a structural reflection of an internal void. By pulling from the neglected, shadowed corners of Greek mythology, specifically the often overlooked lineage of the underworld, Felker is performing a profound structural reclamation. She is not retelling a myth. She is refining the ancient tragedy's blueprint to facilitate a modern psychological assault. She treats the Greek pantheon not as a collection of characters, but as structural dictionary, a set of tools used to build a reality that feels both cosmically vast and claustrophobically personal. What sets Felker apart in the independent landscape is her refusal to lean on the spicy or fantasy labels as a crutch. Instead, she uses these genres as a Trojan horse. She invites the reader in with the idea of romance and myth, only to trap them within a Pillar C architecture. Her work is definitive proof that the most potent indie voices are those who have mastered the unbroken chain, those who know exactly which master's blueprint they are modifying before they ever put pen to paper. In Shadows and Secrets, Felker proves that she isn't just writing within the genre. She is an architect of dread, who understands that the most terrifying things are the ones we inherited before we were even born. And we're going to change things up a little bit in the comparison section. So instead of definitive works, we're going to go with um, architects themselves, either literature or visionaries. So instead of relying or drawing a direct comparison to a particular work, we're going to go with a resonance feel for their creators. So, with that said, let's dive in. I have a Robert Louis Stevenson resonance, The Failure of the Rational Observer. While the cultural memory of Stevenson often fixates on the physical duality of Jekyll and Hyde, the truer resonance here is the collapse of the rational observer. In the Stevenson lineage, the horror is derived from a character who believes they can partition their darker nature behind a wall of intellect or a social mask. In Felker's architecture, the protagonist's reclusive bookstore clerk persona is that doomed mask. Felker expands this by making the other component a mythic, inherited necessity rather than a chemical accident. It captures that precise Stevenson-esque dread, the moment the civilized self realizes it is merely a thin crust of ice over an ancient, boiling ocean of power. This work explores the moment the mask doesn't just slip, it shatters under the weight of a reality that is far older and far hungrier than the human ego. The Ari Aster resonance, the inescapable ritual of predeterminism. From the architecture of Ari Aster, we recognize the concept of the predetermined trap. In this blueprint, the protagonist's life is revealed to be a scripted ritual performed by external ancient forces long before they were ever born. Felker applies this inescapable design to the mythic plane. The protagonist is not a character with agency in the traditional sense. She is a functional piece of an ancient cosmic vendetta. Every vision she suffers, every choice she makes, is a movement in a ritual that began in the Age of Titans. The horror is the realization that autonomy is an illusion. It forces the reader to confront a devastating truth that our lives may simply be the fuel for a fire lit by our ancestors. The Clive Barker resonance, the sensory breach. Clive Barker redefined the genre by proposing that the monstrous is actually an evolution of the sensory. In Barker's lineage, the barrier between pleasure and pain is a sensory breach that, once crossed, fundamentally changes the nature of the soul. Felker utilizes this resonance to handle the visceral elements of her narrative. The bond between the protagonist and the other is not presented as a comfort or a simple romance. It is a Barker-esque synthesis. It is a union that requires the endurance of psychological and physical overload. Felker treats power as Barker did, as something that tears your soul apart to show you what you are truly capable of. It is a realization that to reach a higher state of being, one must first survive the demolition of the human. In the Jordan Peele resonance, the social mask and systemic erasure. The structural mechanics of the sunken place represent the absolute loss of autonomy within a hostile consuming system. Felker mirrors this in the way the internal mythic nature threatens to consume the protagonist's humanity. The reclusive clerk is constantly at risk of falling into the sunken place of her own inherited nature. This is the blueprint of identity siege. We watch a character navigate the sheer exhaustion of performing humanity while a cosmic force is trying to replace her with an it. In the Tananarive Dew resonance, the weight of historical debt. As we have analyzed in the Masters of the Black Southern Gothic, specifically Tananarive Dew, the truer horror is the historical debt. In this tradition, power is not a gift. It is a psychological burden that tethers the individual to centuries of trauma and responsibility. Felker brings this Dew-esque weight to the mythic plane. The invasive empathy the protagonist suffers is the manifestation of an ancestral debt. She is haunted by a history she did not create but is forced to pay for. This provides a bridge between the systemic trauma of the Southern Gothic and the mythic tragedy of the ancient world. It proves that whether the blood is mortal or divine, the debt of the past always collects. In a landscape of independent horror that often mistakes graphic intensity for psychological impact, Joelle Felker's Goddess of Ghosts, Shadows and Secrets achieves a far more difficult and permanent victory. This is a masterclass in the experimental psyche, a work that does not just invite the reader into a world of myth, but traps them within a sensory architecture that refuses to offer the traditional sanctuary of a private self. The brilliance of Felker's project lies in its weaponization of empathy. Typically, horror treats empathy as a tool of salvation. Felker ruthlessly inverts this by engineering a protagonist for whom touch is a structural violation. She transforms connections into a sensory siege. We are presented with a porous self, a psyche with no doors. forced to become a vessel for the subconscious debris of every stranger she encounters. This is the horror of total transparency, executed with a cerebral precision that is rare in modern fiction. What distinguishes his work is its structural alchemy. Felker successfully synthesizes the most potent blueprints of the genre, from the catastrophic failure of the rational mask to the heavy, predeterministic dread of an ancient ritual being performed through the protagonist's very bloodline. Most notably, she treats power not as a gift or a trope, but as a historical debt, a biological necessity for survival in a hostile, indifferent cosmos. Ultimately, Goddess of Ghosts sets itself apart by its refusal to offer a cure. Felker understands that the only way to survive a systemic haunting is to become the architect of the ghost. This is a definitive manual for the reluctant transgressor, for the reader who understands that true autonomy is only found when we stop pretending we belong in the light. It is an ambitious, structural, and visceral achievement that marks the arrival of his significant voice in psychological horror. And just in a real quick breakaway here, um, this book is insanely complex if you really try to put yourself in the author's headspace. There's a lot of different things working, as you can see, just with the initial part of this expose that we've put together. Um, the review itself does kind of hit on things, but I'm going to get into a deeper dive here just because I think it's imperative that you really understand at least my standpoint on why this book belongs. Um, there's a lot of common tropes used in the book, and it's not a bad thing. As I called them earlier, a Trojan horse. Like they're there to as plot drivers, to subject the narrative to a certain pacing, but it's immersed. It's bathing, in this very unique ecosystem of uh, mixed mixed pillars, as we put it on the channel. So as your psyche is being attacked, the atmospheric siege is also there. Um, but you're mindful of the historical significance of what came before, and that's where we got into touching on the Black Southern Gothic. Gothic was the systemic dread element of things, and the protagonist here is almost helpless in this sea of claustrophobia. And I like that metaphor simply because it feels that way when you're reading it. But it does require, I don't want to say a keen mind, but I, um the more that you really look between the words, um, because I believe that Joelle Felker did an amazing job of using sensory language through the let's just take some of the spicy romance scenes, but the sensory language in there isn't just about the romance or isn't just about the sexuality in the scene. And that's the kind of thing that you need to be looking for throughout this book from beginning to end. And I think a lot of the other reviews, I don't want to call another person's opinion wrong, but I think that they missed a lot of these things. And yeah, at any rate, that's why I want to get into the deep dive complete, right after this section, because I think that it's imperative to understand, in my opinion anyway, um, just the enormous narrative depth that can be found in this book. So, with that said, let me get to that. To understand why a work like Goddess of Ghosts demands such clinical structural analysis, we have to step back from the narrative and look at the pillars upon which this archive is built. We do not categorize stories by their monsters, but by their stance on fear. We are looking for the source code of the dread. Pillar A is the external adversary. This is the classic architecture in the Gothic. In this stance, the threat is a trespasser, the vampire, the ghost, the creature in the woods. The fear is a breach of the perimeter, and the protagonist is essentially good or neutral. The goal is to survive the encounter and restore the sanctuary of the home. The terror here is a guest that was never invited. Pillar B is the moral rot. Here, the horror is a mirror. The dread is not a trespasser, it is a direct consequence of a character's choices, secrets, or sins. The monster is a manifestation of a debt that must be paid, whether it is the guilt of a murder or a generational curse triggered by an ancestor's crime. The architecture of the story is built on symmetry. The horror is deserved, and the narrative serves as the trial for the soul. But Pillar C, where we find the most complex and visceral modern works, is the experimental psyche. In this architecture, the horror is neither a trespasser nor a choice, it is a condition. The psyche itself is a laboratory. The protagonist's nervous system, their biology, and their lineage are the experiments being performed by a hostile or indifferent universe. There is no sanctuary to return to and no normal solution to be found, because the threat is baked into the protagonist's very existence. Within this pillar, we look for a specific blueprint that Joelle Felker has mastered: invasive empathy. In common conversation, we treat empathy as a virtue, a bridge between souls. In the archive, it is a sensory siege. When a character cannot interact with the world without being infected by the subconscious debris, sins, and memories of others, the traditional sanctuary of the mind is structurally abolished. The private eye is dead. You are no longer watching a character navigating a haunting. You are inhabiting a vessel that has been forcibly opened to the entire world. Finally, we must recognize the structural handoff. Horror has spent centuries moving the source of dread from the outside in. It began in ancient tragedy as predeterminism. You were a victim of fate, moving toward a doom the gods had already written. You were a passenger in your own life. The modern handoff, which Felker utilizes with such ambition, shifts this towards autonomy. We take that ancient trap, the inescapable design of the gods, and we watch the character refuse the role of the victim. This is where the horror becomes empowering. We are witnessing a metamorphosis. The protagonists stop trying to cure their condition or find the light. Instead, they learn to master the shadows of their own experiment. They stop being the subject of the god's ritual and become the architect of power. We don't look at these works for a return to normal. Once the experimental psyche has been breached, there is no normal left to find. We look at horror to witness the moment the soul is demolished and rebuilt into something that can survive the dark. You shouldn't read this book because you like myth or romance. You should buy it because Joelle Felker has done the impossible. She has taken the psychological siege of Stevenson, the ritualistic trap of Astor, the sensory transgression of Barker, and the systemic weight of Dew, and she has forged them into a single unbreakable chain. She has built a work that respects the heft and might of the archive by refusing to offer a cure for the darkness. Instead, she offers the blueprint for becoming its master. And next up on the archive, while the work of Joelle Felker teaches us how to survive the internal siege of the dark persona, our next entry in the Ledger of Dread asks a far more devastating question. What if the world does not end with a bang, but with a subtraction? We are conditioned by cinema and bad habits to believe the apocalypse is a kinetic event: fire, noise, and the screaming of a planet in agony. But in the archive, we have retrieved a document that proposes a terrifying new thesis. It is a work titled Penumbra, The Unmaking of Earth by H.R. Graves. Graves is not a traditional novelist. He is a reclusive former physicist who has retreated to the misty hills of Vietnam to write by lamplight. His work represents a departure from the invasive empathy we've just explored. In Penumbra, the horror is clinical. It is a study in ethical cosmic horror, where reality itself is not being haunted. It is being solved like an equation that has finally reached its end. If Felker's work is about the poorest self, Graves' work is about the unmaking of the world. It follows the archetype of the guilty witness, a scientist who understands the exact why the sky is fracturing into geometric shapes, because she is the one who did the math that broke the universe. In our next session, we will subject Penumbra to the Lovecraft metric and analyze the horror of wrong math. We will examine why a man who knows how the universe works has chosen to live where the signal is thinnest. The archive is closing the file on the goddess, but we are opening the file on the eclipse. Stay curious, stay terrified. This is the Veiled Archive.